All right, we'll go ahead and get started now. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for starting off day 2 of Ignite here with me. I'm glad you were able to find the conference room that's like furthest from where all of the action is going on. So thanks for hiking all the way over here. I'm going to spend the next hour and 15 minutes talking about building apps and solutions for OneDrive for Business and throw in some OneDrive Personal as well, just to sort of round out the picture. For those of you who aren't familiar with OneDrive, anybody not familiar with OneDrive? No, okay, that's good. I'll just give a brief overview of sort of how we think about the OneDrive service, and then we'll talk about the developer platform for OneDrive and sort of all of the different ways that you can build solutions working with OneDrive, and then I'll do a deep dive into a couple of the ways that we recommend people build those solutions. And then at the end, I'll give you a demo of some upcoming coolness with webhooks, as well as demos all along the way. So for those of you who have been in an Office 365 developer talk already, you've probably seen this slide. If not, then let me introduce sort of the developer vision that we have for Office 365. There's really sort of 2 pillars for the way that we think about things. There's extending the user experience within the Office apps, which is not what I'm talking about here. And then there's actually accessing the data that is held within Office 365 and building solutions on top of that data, and that's what I am talking about here. So what is OneDrive? OneDrive is really the one place for everything in your life and your work. And we have 2 different services that make that possible. We have OneDrive Personal, which is all about your life, your photos, all of your personal documents, and then we have OneDrive for Business, which is the great place to store all of your work documents. It's a great, secure place to store all of these files. OneDrive for Business has the full set of Office 365 compliance capabilities. It has all the great IT features that you guys want that OneDrive Personal doesn't necessarily have. It's a great way to synchronize files across all of your devices, which is particularly interesting as an app developer if you want to be able to access files across the range of devices that your users are using. We also have powerful search capabilities with Bing and with FAST to make it really easy to find documents that have stored in OneDrive. If, like me, you have something like 300 gigabytes of data stored in your OneDrive, browsing through folder hierarchies isn't exactly the most efficient way to find things, but searching is great. We're also deeply integrated with Office. We have great collaboration features with the Office clients. We have the web apps for Office integration on the web. So we have a really tight connection with Office, and we think that's the same sort of tight connection that you should be building your apps to have when you integrate with OneDrive. And then, like I said, it's available for personal and business. So which one should you be using as an app developer? So OneDrive for Business, when we think about integrating with that, it's really about secure enterprise-grade storage for business documents and files. You can think of it as if the organization owns the content that you're working with, it belongs in OneDrive for Business. If the user owns that content, it belongs in OneDrive Personal. But aside from that, both of them sort of have the same set of functionality, and in fact, as of last week, we now have a single shared API that works for both OneDrive and OneDrive for Business, which I'll talk a whole lot more about. But that makes it really easy to do the last bullet point on here, which is that really, if you think about it, you should be building a solution that works for either of them, because as a developer, you may not necessarily know what type of content is being used by your application. And it should be up to the user or the IT administrator or the end user, I guess, to decide which OneDrive that content should actually be stored in. So why use OneDrive as a platform? Like I said, connecting your app into where the files are is really interesting. And as we look at how people are starting to use cloud storage now, more and more of the files are actually being stored in the cloud because it enables all these great end user scenarios accessing their content across all the different endpoints. You guys want to be able to connect into that content as well. When you have an application that you're building that needs to open files, you want to be able to open those files where those files live. And they don't just live on the file system on a local hard disk anymore. They actually now live in the cloud, and connecting your app to live in that cloud is great. We also are the main backend for a bunch of different Microsoft apps, and we enable some great cloud scenarios there. So if you've used Office for iPad, you'll note that the default storage location is actually OneDrive. It isn't on the iPad because that doesn't make any sense, because then how do you get to those documents later on? There's also a great new feature that we're talking about here later today or tomorrow for cloud attachments in Outlook, where you don't have to actually send the attachments around anymore. They live in OneDrive, and they send links to those files to different places. That's another great example of a scenario that you can light up using OneDrive. And I'm sure that scenario is something that you guys could do for your own apps as well. There's also value that OneDrive can provide on top of the files in your application, being able to get to them from any endpoint, being able to get to them from the web, and being able to build on top of those scenarios in your own web apps or your own mobile apps. And then just sort of a great, go out and do this, like build a great killer cloud experience on top of OneDrive. We're working on doing that at Microsoft, and we think that that is a great technology platform for you guys to use to build your own killer apps. So quick overview of what the developer platform is. At the very top, you have your application in blue, and then there's a bunch of different ways that you can actually integrate with content that's stored in OneDrive, OneDrive for Business, and SharePoint. If you're familiar with building for OneDrive for Business or SharePoint, you know what CSOM is. You've used probably the CSOM REST API or the CSOM SDKs in your applications to access content. That's great. It's great for OneDrive for Business. It's great for SharePoint. It doesn't get you OneDrive Personal at all. And the APIs are full-featured and robust, and therefore a little bit complex. On the other side, we have the new OneDrive API, which is that big blue bar on the bottom, and that actually connects to both OneDrive Personal and OneDrive for Business and SharePoint sites. So now you can have a single, straightforward REST API to code against that gets you, connected to both Personal and Business OneDrive, writing just the same code. We think that's really great to unlock a bunch of scenarios that you couldn't unlock before using just CSOM. And then on top of that API, we've built a couple SDK packages, one called Pickers and Savers and one called OneDrive SDK, which I'll dig into here in a little bit more. So Pickers and Savers, these are coming soon for OneDrive for Business, available now for OneDrive Personal. And these are the easiest way to work with files inside OneDrive. It's a few lines of code and you're good to go, being able to open and save files back to OneDrive and OneDrive for Business. Think of this as like the common file dialog from the Win32 days for cloud storage. Today we have support for JavaScript, iOS, and Android, and the Windows platform for OneDrive Personal. OneDrive for Business we support on Android, and we'll be adding support across the rest of those platform layers shortly. To give you an example of what this looks like, here's some JavaScript code from a single-page JavaScript application that goes and gets a download link for a file. So literally, the line that is really important is the bolded one, which is just OneDrive.open, and then you tell it what options are. And the options are really what kind of link do you want, and what function should we call in JavaScript when this thing returns to say, here's the file. To give you an example of that, I will show you this little one-page application that we've written. So I was like, hey, how can we show off this concept really easily? I know, I'll rebuild Notepad on the web. Very simple application, obviously, but it highlights this scenario very well. So I pulled in Bootstrap just to give me a nice little UI framework. I put 2 buttons in there, and then I wrote the following code that's on here to wire up the on-click event for these things. So here's my open button on-click event. So I ask for a download link, and I say, when that download link comes back, just download the file and load it into my editor. Likewise, when the user clicks the Save button, take the content out of the text area that I have, serialize it into a base64 encoded string, and then save that back into OneDrive. So very simple, not that many lines of code, really easy to use. And then when I go actually try this out, you'll see here's my simple little app. I click the Open button, I get this pop-up, it asks me to log in. I get all this great UI that is powered by OneDrive. It looks like the OneDrive experience. It's everything that the user expects looking at OneDrive. I can navigate to a place where my files are, pick my file and open it. And then it thinks for a little bit, and up pops my file. So this is actually a page out of our documentation. Let's say I need to make some changes to it, like hello from Ignite. That's obviously something I would want in my documentation. And I can change the file name to something else. And then click Save. When I do, unfortunately, I get asked to log in again. We'll fix that. And then I can save the file back to somewhere else in OneDrive. Now, this is all OneDrive Personal that I'm showing you here because the OneDrive for Business version of this doesn't exist yet, but we're working on it, and it will be here later this year. So just really simple, really straightforward integration. This is like the bare bones thing. If you care about getting a file out of OneDrive or OneDrive for Business, and loading that into your application. You can also get a sharing link if you say we're an email client and wanted to embed a link to a document instead of just actually pulling in the attachment. You can ask for that kind of link as well. And then if you're saving a file back to OneDrive, obviously you just provide the contents, or you can provide the URL, you can provide the URL for that file, and we'll save it into OneDrive for you. So like I said, available Q3 probably for OneDrive for Business. We are working on getting that out there. We know that it is super important. It's probably the top customer ask that we hear for, hey, why doesn't OneDrive for Business have one of these things? I just want to quickly light up my app with that sort of thing. So we're working on it soon. The next big thing to talk about is the OneDrive API. And like I said, we've had the new OneDrive API for OneDrive Personal since February. And we've gotten a ton of great feedback about the API and how easy it was to integrate into applications. And so we wanted to bring that to OneDrive for Business as well and have this unified platform between OneDrive and OneDrive for Business. So as of last week at the Build conference, we actually announced that we now have a preview available for the OneDrive API for OneDrive for Business, which I'm super excited about. And I can't wait to hear the feedback from everyone in here about how they like using that thing. We're looking to take it out of preview by the end of this year for OneDrive for Business, and we'll talk about sort of why it's in preview right now and what the gaps are as we go on. But OneDrive API really is the evolution of the Files API v1. So in October, we launched the Office 365 Files API, which was a brand new REST API. You can think of OneDrive API as really v2 of that API. So if you're familiar with OneDrive or with Files API, a lot of the same concepts and metaphors exist in the OneDrive API. We've just tweaked a few things to align them between what OneDrive Personal offers and what OneDrive for Business offers. And unfortunately, to do that, we had to do it in a way that wasn't 100% backwards compatible with Files API v1. So OneDrive API is expressed as Files API v2 inside the Office 365 REST namespace. It's all still based on OData v4, if you're familiar with that. The really great thing about OData compatibility isn't so much that you can use an OData client to access the content. Well, that's nice. It really is that across the entire suite of Office 365 apps, we have the same set of principles. So if you want to be able to restrict what properties come back when you do a call, you can use $select. If you want to be able to filter something, you can use $filter. If you want to be able to find changes, you can do Delta calls. There's a lot of consistency between Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive for Business, and other platforms that are using that same API, or the same OData libraries. The key point here for OneDrive for Business and why it's still in preview is there's a pretty reduced set of functionality compared to OneDrive Personal today. We have all the basic file operations. You can upload a file, you can download a file, you can copy a file around, you can move a file, you can get all the metadata on files. All of the advanced scenarios that you'll want to be able to do, like creating a sharing link, doing a Delta call to be able to see what's changed on the service, all of those are still coming. And so I didn't want to go out there and say, hey, look, we have this great new API that's missing all of the functionality that you really want, but it's a general availability release. So we're calling it a preview for now. As far as what's documented in the way the API is designed, it isn't really going to change because it aligns to what we have on the personal side. So if you build a solution against the OneDrive API and it works on OneDrive Consumer and it works on OneDrive for Business, that's great. You're good to go. Don't worry about that being something that's going to get broken in the future. And also, like, as I said, the support for OneDrive for Business is lagging a little bit behind. It's also, as you saw yesterday, kind of falls in line with what Windows is doing, where we take everything on the personal side and we really make sure that it's baked at scale in our personal service, and then we roll it out to the business side once we've proven that everything is solid, everything is reliable, and everything is good to go. So digging into the OneDrive API a little bit more to talk about how to use it and how everything works. The first thing to talk about for OneDrive API is, unlike a traditional object-oriented programming environment where we have classes that represent all the different types of things, so you could have a class for a file and a class for a folder. Instead, we have one base type for all of the different files and folders inside OneDrive and OneDrive for Business. It's conveniently called item. Off of that item class, we have a bunch of properties, or what we use the term facets, to denote what something actually is. If you're familiar with the common knowledge model, or CKM, it's the same sort of concept that they use in that world. So if something is a folder, it will have a folder property on it. Anything that has a folder property on it, you can treat like a folder. It may not actually be a folder. At some point in the future, it might be a app bundle or a collection of files, or a zip file could potentially even have a folder property on it if we got a little crazy. Similarly, things like file or photo or document will have those properties on them to indicate that whatever this item is this type of thing, and you can treat it that way. An interesting example is, what is a OneNote notebook? Because technically, when you look at the file system at the raw level, a OneNote notebook is a folder with all of the stuff in it. When you look at the UI that we actually render on top of that thing, it's a file. And when it syncs down using our sync client, it syncs down as a .url file. How do you treat that thing? Is it a folder? Is it a file? What is it? It's actually, in our API, neither. It is a OneNote, and you can treat it like a OneNote and know that that is the type of special thing that it is. We also have deleted as a property to know that something has been deleted in views that return deleted items. Another big change that we did when we looked at the new OneDrive API was how do you actually navigate to items in the URL? So when you look at what some of our competition does, some of them say every item has a unique identifier that's immutable, only use that identifier to look up items. If you want to navigate 4 levels deep in the hierarchy, you have to make a call, get all the children from one, find the ID of the next level of hierarchy, and sort of recurse down through a set of API calls to find the item you're actually looking for. Other competition that we have has decided to take an entirely path-based approach where you have to know the hierarchy of a file, and if the user moves that file, good luck finding it again. We've sort of said, hey, both of those actually make sense. We don't want to necessarily pick one and force somebody into using that model, so we're going to support both. And we did it in a single REST namespace. So you can see the 2 examples there at the top. The first one is a path-based URL. So you can do /drive/root to say, hey, I'm interested in path space. And then you can do the colon, which says transition out of the REST namespace for this URL and for the service into the hierarchy of the user's actual drive. And so you do : and then Contoso, project A, and then a colon again to transition back into our REST namespace, and then you can get the children. Similarly, you can use item IDs in place of paths. So you can do /drive/items, and then if you happen to know the item ID for that thing, you can grab it that way. So if you care about tracking a folder or a file, regardless of where the user moves it to, you can use a unique identifier to find it that way. If you care about navigating path hierarchy, you can very simply navigate path hierarchy. And you can actually, as the next bullet point shows, you can combine the 2. So if you know that a particular folder has an ID of F0A, but then you're looking for a document with a particular name inside of it, you can use /drive/items/folder ID : /document name to be able to look that thing up. You can also do that, like if you know the top level of your folder in the hierarchy, but then you want to get to 3 levels underneath that, you can do that as well. So ID plus path. It makes it really flexible to just be able to find whatever you're looking for in whatever way is most convenient for you. You can also actually address entities inside items. So the last example here is /drive/items and then a file. In this case, that file happens to be a picture. You can then say, get me the thumbnail collection off of that file and give me the first large thumbnail that that file has, all within one URL, and you'll get back the metadata for that thumbnail. So you don't have to get the item metadata, parse the item metadata to figure out where the thumbnails are, and then find the thumbnail you're looking for. You can actually just make a one single REST API call to get that information. Uploading files is also obviously really important to a service like OneDrive and OneDrive for Business. We provide 3 different ways to do it, which might seem a little excessive, but each of them has their own sort of unique benefit. The simplest, most straightforward thing to do is just put to the file URL that you're looking for /content. We support that for files up to 100 megabytes in size. The reason that 100 megabyte file size limit there is we don't want you to upload a gigabyte file and have the connection drop when you're at 0.9 gigabytes and then you have to start all over again. So we scope this to really sort of small files, which is actually what most of the files in OneDrive and OneDrive for Business are. They fit into that limit. That just lets you put the binary content up there. So you specify the file name and the URL, and you specify the actual binary content of the file, and you're good to go. If you care about doing more than that, like setting the description on a file or setting additional metadata on that file, you can post to the children collection and provide the binary content for the file and a JSON description of the metadata that you want to store on that file, all in one single API call. And we will go create the file, put that metadata on it, and stick it in OneDrive. And then the last option is the ability to upload large files. So if you post to upload.createSession, we will return back a URL that you can write content to, and then you can upload individual fragments of that file. We recommend something on the order of like 4 to 10 megabytes at a time, so that you're not restoring, or you don't have to go back and restore a bunch of content later if something happens during that upload. And each fragment that we get, we remember and hold on to, and then once we have all of the fragments that represent the file, we commit the file into OneDrive, and everything is good to go, and the file shows up. That way you can upload files up to the maximum size supported by OneDrive, which I think is 10 gigabytes right now, without worrying about restarting that upload and losing a ton of content and eating up a ton of bandwidth. Those are like the most simple basic things that you can do. Now there's some sort of advanced scenarios that we support as well. So there's the view.changes API or the Delta API, which is actually a way that you can find out what changed inside OneDrive without pulling every folder. Today we see a usage pattern that basically says, hey, I'm really interested in everything within this set of folders. How do I go figure that out? Well, I'll just enumerate the contents of every folder every time, and look at the E tags on all of those items and see if anything has changed. It turns out that that's really not efficient and it ends up being like something on the order of tens of thousands of API calls that you have to make to find out what's going on inside a folder hierarchy. View.changes optimizes that to say, just let me know that, like the first time you call it, let me know the state of everything that's in OneDrive or within the hierarchy that I care about inside OneDrive. And then after that, we'll give you a token, and the next time you call back, you can say, here's the token I got last time, tell me everything that has changed since then. And you'll either get back nothing, or you'll get back a set of files that have been modified, created, or deleted since that time. The big thing or sort of the big caveat here is that if you take an item out of that hierarchy, so if you're syncing root, this doesn't really happen very often. If you're syncing a folder hierarchy underneath root and the user takes the file and moves it outside of that folder, we don't have the ability to tell you that file is deleted because that record moved out. And so you'll get a resync operation that says, hey, start over again, like reset your cache back to 0 and try again. We don't see that happen very often though, but it's an important caveat to remember. Another great new feature that we've added is something that people have asked for a little while, which is the app folder. So a lot of times applications will log into OneDrive for Business because they want to store content in OneDrive or they want to keep their own set of files in OneDrive. And the only permission scheme that we had was give us access to your entire OneDrive. You know, either read access or read-write access, but access was scoped to the entire drive, which as a user, you know, if you don't trust the app completely or you're not entirely sure what the app is going to do with the content that you have in your OneDrive, it's scary to sit there and say, oh yeah, sure, just access everything in my OneDrive. It's no big deal. You know, I keep my tax records in OneDrive, and so when an app pops up and says like, hey, I want full read-write access to everything, I'm like, I don't know if I trust that. And in fact, when we looked at the data, 50% of users declined the consent dialog that says, do you want to allow this application to have full access to OneDrive? That's a pretty steep number considering they were interested enough to actually connect the app to OneDrive in the first place, or start the flow to connect the app to OneDrive. So by creating an app folder, what we did was we created a new permission scheme that said, this application will only have access to a folder that is unique and created just for that application. And it can read and write content within that folder just fine, but it can't see anything outside of that folder. We think that this restricted access level makes your app a lot more trustworthy because now you don't have access to everything in the entire OneDrive. You have access to just the set of files that your application would care about and that your application can create. And users can put files in there, and then the app will see them, and users can take files out of there, and then the app won't see them. And the user can actually move that folder around anywhere within their OneDrive hierarchy, and the code that you have to write in your app doesn't change because we know where that folder is, and we can map the URL that you're using to get to the app folder back to wherever that file happens to live. Another important thing for people who are developing JavaScript apps or who are building single-page web apps is being able to do cross-origin resource sharing, or CORS. We just recently announced that CORS was fully supported now for SharePoint and Exchange and all of the other Office 365 APIs, which is great. We also have full support on the OneDrive personal side. We don't restrict the set of APIs that are available via CORS, so all of the operations that you can do through OneDrive API are available as another application, as another web application. So I'll show you a demo in a little bit about a single-page web app that accesses full OneDrive and OneDrive for Business and enumerates everything and sort of plays with the API. The caveat to CORS, though, is if you're using IE and SharePoint or OneDrive for Business is in the trusted zone, IE doesn't allow CORS calls between trusted and internet zone. So you might be running your app in internet zone and have your SharePoint site in the trusted zone and be like, I can't make any cross-origin calls, what's going on? That's a by design thing for current versions of IE. If you want to get around that, you'll have to proxy the calls through a service component that you would have to own, unfortunately. App permission scopes, I talked about this a little bit in the context of app folder, but there's really 3 core permission scopes that we offer. It's on the personal side, it's OneDrive.read-only. On the business or the Office 365 side, it's myfiles.read, which is read-only access to everything inside the user's OneDrive and OneDrive for Business. OneDrive.read-write or myfiles.read-write, it's read-write access to everything. And then the OneDrive.app folder or myfiles.app folder creates that folder for your application inside the OneDrive. And that isn't yet available for OneDrive for Business, but it is on our radar and will be coming soon. And we encourage you guys to always use the least restrictive permissions possible because it makes the user more comfortable allowing your app to connect to their personal data or their corporate data. So I talked a whole lot about a bunch of API features within the space, but now let me actually show you how all this stuff works. So the easiest thing to do if you are interested in playing around with this on your own is if you go to dev.onedrive.com and see our documentation on our webpage, you can click on this link at the top which says console. And this will actually take you to an Apogee-based console, which is a great service for sort of playing around with APIs. So you can use Fiddler if you want to. You could use curl if you want to. The sort of downside to both of those is you have to go get an auth token so that you can actually make the API calls. Our Apogee console takes care of all of this for you to make this really simple. So here I am. I drop down authentication, and I say OAuth and plus a grant. I'm going to sign in with my OneDrive for Business account. I get single sign-in because I'm already signed into something, and now I can make whatever API calls I want to make. So in this case, the URL is really long because I have this crazy tenant name that somebody made for me. But if you see the underscore API, it should look familiar, and then v2.0 is our new API in scope, and then the drive. So when I make this call, this is just going to return basic information about my OneDrive for Business. And if I scroll down underneath all these headers, you can see basic things like, here's my drive, it's a business drive, it has a unique identifier, it has an owner whose name is Bill Test. It has a unique identifier for that person, so you could look them up in Azure Active Directory if you wanted to, and then it has quota information about this particular OneDrive. So you can see how much space is being taken up by deleted files, how much of my quota is remaining, and how much of my total space available is. And then state indicates that you're not exceeding quota right now, everything is fine. If I was getting close to quota or it was over my quota, that would be reflected by the state value. So you don't have to actually do the math yourself. Then I can do simple things like if I want to get to the root, I can just do /drive/root. And then this is the folder that represents the root of my OneDrive. In the SharePoint world, this is the root of the document library. So it's that core default document library within my OneDrive for Business site. If you've managed to figure out how to create another document library in your OneDrive for Business, which I hope you didn't, this API won't actually let you access that. It's only about default document libraries right now. If I want to then, say, get the children of my folder, I can just do /children. And here is an array containing all of the different files and folders that I have inside my drive. You can see an example here where this is a folder because it is a folder property. I can see how many items are within that folder. I can see all of the different metadata about this thing. The other caveat I'll point out is that in OneDrive for Business right now, size for a folder is always 0. Eventually, the size will actually be the total file size of all of the files stored within that folder, but that's not something that we have wired up just yet. That's a key difference between OneDrive Personal and OneDrive for Business here. And then if I want to do something fancy, like do my cloud role folder, I can go to root/cloud role, :/children. And now what this did was it said, go to the root of this OneDrive for Business, find a folder named cloud role, and pull back all the children under that folder. So again, everything works just like you would expect. It's just really straightforward and simple to call that API and get what you're looking for back. So that's kind of what I can show you on the OneDrive for Business side. I'm going to switch over to the OneDrive consumer side so that I can show you more of the API service that will be coming soon to OneDrive for Business. Sign in here. So here, I get the same structure. I can do /drive/root, get data back, and do drive root children. All the same API structures, all the same JSON return data. Everything is the same between those two services. So when you're writing code against them, you don't have to think about which service am I connecting to. You can just make the API calls and everything happens. If you want to know what's changed inside something, you can do this view.changes. And in this case, I'll do something fancy like select ID name etag. Oh, I need to do changes. So what this did is it went and said, let's find everything in this OneDrive and return it back to me because I didn't provide a sync token. And my select statement says, I'm only really interested in the ID name and etag properties, so just return those back to me. Don't return back that full set of metadata. You can also, if you wanted to know if something was a folder or a file, you could ask for those properties as well. And then you'll get back things like, oh, hey, this is a file, test copy file.txt. It has some hashes. It has MIME types. It has all of this sort of nice information. Here's a folder called API Test Tool. You can just easily see everything that you're looking for there. And then at the top, you'll see here, there's this token value, changes.token, which says, next time you call, pass this token value in, and you'll be able to see what's changed since then. So in this case, I got back a few more items. Just the root changed in this case. And then if I make one more call using this token, you'll see that nothing comes back because now I'm up to date. I type wrong. There we go. So now you'll see the value collection is completely empty because nothing has changed, and the changes.hasMoreChanges property is false. So if you are interested in maintaining a copy of the metadata or the state information inside somebody's OneDrive, this is a really simple API that lets you know what's going on, lets you keep track of adds and deletes and when files are modified so that you can maintain your copy of what's going on in that world. Another thing that you can do really easily if you want to is you can ask for a sharing link to something. So if I say /root/sharing.createLink, actually I'll just go over here and click. And then I'll say for the item ID, I'm just going to do /root and share my entire OneDrive, which is probably not a great idea, but whatever. And then submit this request. You'll see it create a new sharing link, and then down here is the information about that link. So the app that created the link is stored, the type of link that was created, in this case it was a view link, it could have also been an edit link, and then what the actual sharing link is. This is a great way if your application wants to, say, share files without actually transmitting the file contents, or if you want to set permissions. Well, actually, this won't let you do that. But if you want to create an anonymous link to share the file across different places, one of the things that you're probably asking is, like on the OneDrive for Business side in particular, is how do I set explicit permissions for users instead of creating a link that anybody who gets the link can receive? And that is an API that is coming soon, I promise. There's also a couple other cool things that you can do. So like I said, if you're interested in the app folder, you can do /special/approot. And that should have worked. Oh, I'm posting, that's what's going on. There we go. So this actually gets me back the app folder that I was talking about before, and then I can put files, get files, do whatever I want to within this scope. I could also call view.changes within the app folder scope if I wanted to sync just my app folder hierarchy. We also have a couple other special folders defined. So there's the Documents folder, if you want to get back the default Documents folder. In OneDrive for Business, the default Documents folder is just the root of OneDrive for Business because we don't have a special Documents folder in it. If you want to get like the Photos folder, you can ask for that. That returns back the ID and all the information for the Photos folder. In the OneDrive for Business world, we'll actually go create a Photos folder if you make this API call. So if that scenario doesn't make sense in OneDrive for Business, you might want to be careful which special folders you're asking for because you don't want to pollute their namespace with a bunch of folders they don't care about. I'll switch back over here now. So that is just a sort of quick overview into what's going on in the OneDrive API space and how to sort of quickly make calls. So OneDrive API for OneDrive for Business right now, sort of doing a juxtaposition between OneDrive Personal and OneDrive for Business. Everything is available in production on the OneDrive Personal side. In OneDrive for Business, this is just a preview right now, but it actually is available in production. So if you pull up your own SharePoint tenant and make the same API calls that you saw me just making there, everything will work, which is kind of cool. It's rare that previews actually happen in production like this, so I'm pretty happy about that. Authentication is different between the two, and I'll go into that a little bit more in another demo I'm going to do. But on the OneDrive for Business side, you need to do OAuth 2 against Azure Active Directory. You need to go through all of the steps to go create an application within Azure Active Directory and then provision that application and call it that way. On the OneDrive for Personal side, you use OAuth with Microsoft Account because that's the account system that we use for OneDrive Personal. So there is a little bit of a difference that you have to do there around which user you have and how they're logging in. You can use the Office 365 Discovery API to take an email address and turn it around and tell you whether or not it's a OneDrive for Business or a OneDrive Personal account to help automate that instead of having a button that says sign in with OneDrive and another button that says sign in with OneDrive for Business if you want to. There's also, the endpoints are a little bit different. For OneDrive Personal, there's a single REST namespace, which is just api.onedrive.com. On the SharePoint side, because each tenant has their own URL, you actually need to discover the tenant's URL to use. And again, the Office 365 Discovery API makes that easy to do. Today, you have basic upload, download, and file operations on the OneDrive for Business side versus the full API that I kind of showed you in the Apogee console here today. We're literally working, there are engineers back at Redmond who might be awake right now, frantically working on filling the gaps between what we have on the personal side and what we have on the business side to make sure that we have this great, complete, robust API between both things. And then, like I said a little bit ago, the OneDrive for Business API only works against default document libraries. So if you have multiple document libraries within the same site, you'll only be able to get to the default one using the OneDrive API. Whoa, that was not where I wanted to go. Here's where I want to go. So the next demo I want to show you guys is this app called CloudRoll. And what it is it's a camera app for Windows Phone that enables you to send a photo directly from the app to OneDrive or OneDrive for Business. We think of this app as being very useful for HBI scenarios, like I take a picture of a whiteboard that has all of my strategic plans on it. I don't actually necessarily want that picture to land on my phone in case my phone gets lost, so it's just going to stick it straight into OneDrive for Business. Conversely, you might take pictures that you want to not have on your phone in your personal life and put those straight into OneDrive for Personal as well. I'm not going to make any assumptions about what those pictures are. I'll let you guys figure that one out. But the way that we actually went about writing the app is really simple. If I go to Visual Studio, so there's a bunch of framework here. This is a Windows 8.1 universal app. I didn't have a chance to convert everything over to Windows 10 and get Windows 10 running on my phone, so I apologize for that. But everything is actually within this shared project anyway, so it made it really simple. And there's a bunch of files like camera helper and little Watson to send feedback data and all of these things that aren't actually that interesting. The most interesting thing here is the OneDrive helper class. And inside this, we need to be able to handle uploading a file stream from the camera that we get back to either OneDrive Personal or OneDrive for Business. And most of that logic happens here inside this method that is post-image. And so the first thing that we do is we ask for a connection to OneDrive or OneDrive for Business. And there's a Boolean flag here that tells us which one we're looking for. And on the consumer side, if the user is trying to upload this to their personal account, we have a little wrapper around a Windows API that just gets us back an access token. So we don't have to think about OAuth. We don't have to think about how to do authentication. We don't have to think about any of those details. We just call the Windows API that says, hey, I'm interested in uploading a file to OneDrive. Give me back an access token. And the phone or the platform takes care of all of that for us. And then we get back an access token and we can make the call. On the OneDrive for Business side, it's a little bit more complicated because those APIs aren't baked into the platform, but there's a wonderful library called ADAL, which is open source on GitHub and available for pretty much every platform you can imagine that will handle all of the OneDrive for Business and Azure Active Directory authentication for you. So you give it a client ID, you give it what service or what sites you're interested in having access to, and then it gets you back an access token very simply. So depending on which way I'm going, I have to call a different library and then get back a different access token, but then the access token that I get back is just an opaque string that I deal with, and I remember those and hold on to them. Once I have that, I actually initialize a connection using the sample SDK that we have available as part of our GitHub repository. So if you go to github.com/OneDrive, you'll find all of our sample code. The Windows project has a little mini SDK in it. It's not our official SDK. That is still coming, but it's usable, and that's actually what the sample is built on. And then once I have that connection, assuming I get a connection back and don't abort at this point, I take the image stream, I generate a file name using the current time. I find the parent folder by a string, so in this case, I'm looking for the CloudRoll folder, which is just this nice string, CloudRoll, nothing complicated. And then I say put new file into parent item async, and that will actually call the put command on /drive/root : whatever the string that I provided was, /content, and just do a very simple REST put call. And then when that's done, we'll go ahead and generate a sharing link on the OneDrive consumer side using the sharing.createLink API call that I showed you before. Or on the OneDrive for Business side, since we haven't implemented that yet, you'll just get back a web URL, which requires authentication. But literally everything is here in one set of code. There's not two different code paths. There's not two different things that I have to deal with here. In fact, I'll put a breakpoint right here and actually run this up on the phone. And you guys can see that the same breakpoint gets hit for both call patterns. So here's the phone screen. Hopefully you can see that all well. Take a picture of the audience, and I'll hit the consumer button this first time. And I will take a picture for the consumer side. And you see here my breakpoint gets hit. Everything is initialized for the OneDrive consumer connection. And when I hit go, I should get a prompt here that tells me that my photo was uploaded successfully. Yep, there we go. So image was sent to my personal OneDrive. And it took forever because I hit my breakpoint. Then on the other side, I'll take another picture. Let's say something very important and businessy like my monitor here. And this time it's going to ask me to log in because it doesn't have the existing login context because my phone isn't associated with my Microsoft account. So I'll log in using my Bill Test account again, click sign in, and then you should see my breakpoint get hit here, and the file will actually be uploaded to OneDrive for Business. Maybe. Let's try that one more time. Yep, there we see my breakpoint get hit. So same exact code, same SDK, same API calls that are getting made, just to a different endpoint with a different access token. And when I click continue here, again, I'll get the prompt that says, hey, your image was sent to OneDrive for Work, or OneDrive for Business. So the simple little app, same exact code running for both OneDrive and OneDrive for Business makes it really easy to have a solution that can work with either of the two services depending on the scenario that you're looking for or the scenario the user is looking for. And then to highlight this a little bit further, there's actually a single-page JavaScript app that I've written, which is Choose a OneDrive, which lets you sign into either OneDrive or OneDrive for Business, and then we can go look at the files that just got uploaded. So in this case, I'll sign into OneDrive for Business first. I get single sign-in because I've already logged into this account before. And then here is my OneDrive for Business account. Here's all the metadata that's coming back from that account. So you can see all of the properties for all of the items. If I drill into the CloudRoll folder, here you can see all of the pictures that I've taken, and if I drill into this one and open it, you should see a picture of my Surface right here. So that was the photo that I just uploaded to OneDrive, OneDrive for Business. Now if I switch over, and I'll use Chrome for this one, here's me signed into my OneDrive Personal, just to prove that it actually works. And you'll see things are a little bit richer on this side because OneDrive Personal has thumbnail support right now, so you can actually already see the picture that I took, but if I drill into the CloudRoll folder, you can see all of the fun personal pictures that I've taken, and here's the picture of you guys. And when I actually click it takes me straight to OneDrive, the OneDrive website. And then if I look at the code for this application, which is really straightforward, oh, wrong place. There's a little bit of a if statement again at the top, which is if you're using a personal account or sending in a personal, here's the application details that I need to sign into. Here's the redirect URL. Here's the auth service URL that I'm using. Likewise, on the OneDrive for Business side, I'm not using the ADAL library here. I'm just using a basic OAuth library that works the same across Microsoft account and Azure Active Directory, since both of them implement just basic OAuth 2. In this case, I'm providing a bunch of details about the app from Azure Active Directory where I registered the app. So you'll see my client ID up here is this nice hex number. My client ID down here for Azure Active Directory is a GUID. I give it the same redirect URL that I want to call back to, and then I give it the auth service URL for the Azure Active Directory service instead of for the Microsoft account. And then all of the code below that, if I can scroll down more, is the same code. Everything just takes that access token and the URL that's defined and does work based on all of that. And this is actually a sample that started out, let me scroll down to where the interesting stuff is. This is a sample that started out as just a sample for OneDrive Personal, and then we were really easily able to go add support for OneDrive for Business to it as well. What am I looking for? Here it is. So we just build a URL up at the top, and then execute an AJAX request using jQuery to go pull back that data, provide the access token, and then parse the data out and load that UI. And it's just the same app, the same code running in both places, very clean, very straightforward. with a little bit of a trick around auth, being able to go to the right service. So quickly recapping on the OneDrive for Business side, I want to emphasize that this is a journey that we're on with OneDrive for Business. It's all sort of starting on the OneDrive Personal side and then migrating into OneDrive for Business. So there's a bunch of functionality that exists in OneDrive Personal that is coming to OneDrive for Business, including the ability to generate sharing links, the ability to do view.changes, thumbnails, the upload large files API call, and search. That's roughly the order that we're looking at doing them in right now based on prioritizations through our user voice webpage and looking at the API call counts that we're seeing on the personal side. We would love to get feedback from you guys about what's important for the apps that you're building and what's important in the API just overall for your scenarios. So if you go to our user voice page, which is linked from the deck, or just onedrive.uservoice.com, please add things that you feel like are missing from the API. Please vote for the things that are there already to help prioritize. We want to be plugged into the community, plugged in with all of the developers who are interested in building on the API, and make sure that we're doing the right things at the right time to enable the scenarios that you guys want and to unblock your development. There's a nice little link there at the bottom, which is all of the deltas that we have between the OneDrive Personal API and the OneDrive for Business API. I'm going to keep that file updated as we check in new things and they ship to production. We'll remove things from that list or cross them out. If we develop new differences or find new gaps between the two APIs, we'll call them out on that page. So as you're building, that's a great reference to know from the documentation that we have available for the OneDrive API what doesn't work or what works differently on the OneDrive for Business side. Now, one of the other things I want to talk about today is a very early look. So OneDrive API for OneDrive for Business is a preview. It's available in production. You can go use it and play with it today. What I'm going to talk about now doesn't exist in a way that you guys can use in either platform, OneDrive for Business or OneDrive Personal, but will be coming very soon for OneDrive Personal. And then once we have proven that the system works and that we've baked it all in and feel like we have the right design, we'll bring it to OneDrive for Business later this year. But if you're not familiar with webhooks, webhooks are an easy way for us to notify your application or your service that something has changed in OneDrive. So as I was saying earlier, we have a bunch of traffic that sits there and polls OneDrive today looking for changes. And that accounts for a huge number of API calls where most of the time they find that nothing has changed and they go back and wait 5 minutes and then come back and poll us again. By adding the view.changes API, we've been able to take traffic patterns that were like tens of thousands of calls per day per user and reduce them down to one or like hundreds of calls per day per user, which is great. But with webhooks, we think we can actually bring that down to only the calls that are necessary to actually know what has changed inside the service. And really improve the efficiency of your application, improve the efficiency and scale of our service dealing with those calls, and just make it better for everyone. And our webhook model is sort of what we call poke and pull. So what we do is we say, send you a notification to your application that says, user XYZ had something change. Please call us and find out what it is. And then your application can call back into the service using view.changes and find out what files have changed, if it's a delete, if it's an add, or whatever it is. One of the advantages of doing that is that we're not sending any PII information to that webhook. So we can send it from anywhere to anywhere and make sure that there's complete compliance and security involved in that, because all we're doing is saying, this ID is based on a unique identifier, this user's data has changed. You now call into the API using the access token that you have and figure out what it was that has changed. This is coming in May, hopefully for OneDrive, and then it will be later in the year, probably Q3 or Q4 for OneDrive for Business. So quick little overview of how this works from a call perspective. On the far left side, you can see your application is that orange bar. In the middle, the purple bar is the user, and then the blue bar on the right side is OneDrive. So the first thing that happens is your application or you as the developer will register for webhooks, and we're sort of interested in feedback on the right model there. We've looked at one model where at an application registration level, you give us a single URL that we will call for all changes that happen to all users who are using your app. The other model that we're looking at is that at runtime, your application would call in to our service and give us a URL specific to that user, potentially, that we would call back. So there's pros and cons both ways. One is simpler and easier to get started. One actually lets you potentially route webhook calls to different endpoints depending on what region your user is in. And so we're looking for feedback on that. Once you've set up that registration, then everything is good. Your app is sitting out there silently waiting for something to happen. The user comes along and makes a change to a file in OneDrive or OneDrive for Business. We detect that change and queue it up, and within a few seconds, we'll process that queue and push a notification out to your website or out to your application. And the way that that works right now is it's actually a HTTP post call to whatever that URL that you gave us was. We're also looking at integrating with Azure Notification Hub so that if you don't want to run a web service but want to get push notifications to an app running on a device, you can easily do that as well. And then once that notification is received by your application, you'll process that, make sure that you know who that user is, find the access token or the refresh token that you need to actually call into the APIs for that user, and call the view.changes API to know what has changed, receive those changes back, and process that however you want to actually process it. So in the magic world of super pre-production software, I will attempt to demo for you how all of this works. So, like I said before, I have a Visual Studio project. Inside this Visual Studio project, I just created a simple website project that's hosted on Azure. And I added the API, the web API framework to that project so that I could do just simple API controllers. And I created this webhook API controller, which, because I'm just being really straightforward, it takes HTTP post and has a route of my website /API/webhook. And then if you are familiar with Web API, you might expect that inside the parameters of this post method would be the deserialized object that I'm using. Because of the way the pre-production environment is set up and the data that it's sending to me, I couldn't actually do that. So I have to manually deserialize the body of this webhook, of the post, into a webhook. Assume that when we actually reach production status, we won't have to do any of that. And then I get the subscription ID or the user ID out of the webhook notification. I look up that subscription inside my internal database of subscriptions that are users that have registered with my application. And assuming that everything is found and works good, then I queue in my worker queue to go update the contents of that subscription. And if I look at what my worker queue is doing, down here I'll sort of skip over all the lookup stuff, is just this process changes for subscription method, which is going to record some telemetry about what's going on, figure out if this is the first time that we've sunk this account or a subsequent sync so that we know whether or not there's an access token and what set of data to ask for. And then it makes this view changes async call, which is just a lightweight wrapper around that view.changes API call that I showed you in the Apogee console to go figure out or return an array of all the different data that's changed. Because it is possible that that single call won't return all of the data that I need to, you'll see that this is actually in a loop, and that I pull in a page of changes at a time, and if there are more changes, I process that page of changes, and then if there are more changes, I will actually go back and call things again. In this case, just as a sort of cute demo, the process changes thing is actually going to take any text file that it finds that is changed, run it through the Microsoft Translator API, and translate it from English to German. So you can imagine the fun bug that I ran into where I hadn't quite scoped it quite right and translated every single file in my OneDrive into German. That's fine. But I will go log into the web app that's actually running behind this, which is, or sorry, not the web app, into the OneDrive website. And I'll go to the translate folder, which is where I've conveniently scoped this thing to run after I hit that first bug. And I'll just go create a new plain text file inside this folder, and the text editor that OneDrive has will pop up, and I'll say, hello from Ignite in Chicago. And I'll save this file. So this just wrote the file back into my OneDrive account. Behind the scenes, that subscription has fired. The webhook has gone off to my Azure service. My Azure service has downloaded the contents of this text file, run it through the Microsoft Translator API, and if I switch back to the translate folder and everything worked, you'll see there's now untitled underscore translated.txt. And when I open this up, you'll see the German translation of the string that I just wrote. All of that happening basically in real time or near real time, no polling involved. My application in Azure isn't sitting there doing anything other than waiting for this post to come in and processing it. So super lightweight, super easy call pattern, really easy to hook up, and now you can respond to changes in real time and know what's actually going on within that OneDrive account. So hopefully you guys are excited about that. Hopefully you can imagine all the great ways that you would use this inside your application. This is designed right now just to be between the OneDrive service and a web app or a web service. We're certainly looking, like I said, at using Azure Notification Service to enable this same scenario for device applications as well. so that you don't have to write a proxy service that receives the webhook and then figures out which device to send that notification to make things easy. Let's see, go back over here. So that is available soon for OneDrive, hopefully by the end of this month, and then coming later this year for OneDrive for Business. And if you watch dev.onedrive.com for more details, we'll certainly start talking about this stuff when it becomes available. The final thing that I want to talk about today is our documentation. So when we started working on all of this new API a year ago, we sat down and we said, documentation is actually critical. It is the way that people understand how the API works. And we took a ton of work to go design a really intuitive, straightforward API where you don't need to read the documentation and you can sort of guess what the URL is. And if you're not right, our error messages will hopefully help you get to the right place. And most of the time you will be right. But we know that every now and then you run into a case where you don't know what's going on, or you're interested in just sort of having an overview of what the documentation is. So we wanted to be the best when it came to documentation. We knew that our docs in the past were not great. We got plenty of feedback about how we needed to make our documentation better, and so that's what we set out to do. A couple of the ways that we did that are the product team actually now is writing the documentation for this as the very first thing that we do. So in the old world, it used to be that somebody would write a spec for how the API worked, some developer would go implement that API, and then some writer would take the spec and the implementation and go sort of figure out how it worked and what the design criteria were and all of that and write the documentation for it. Now the process that we're using is actually that the program manager sits down and writes the end user documentation for that feature as the spec for the API. So we are describing it from the very beginning in terms that we would give to you guys to say, here's how you use the thing. We then give that documentation to our development team who goes off and builds the API based on the end user documentation, and then we are able to publish the documentation. So in the past, we would write documents like 3 to 4 weeks before we'd actually ship an API. And now we tend to write it 2 months before we write the API, so we have a lot more time to iterate on the documentation, get feedback on it, make sure it's great before you guys ever see it. The other thing that we've done is we've made all of our documentation open source on GitHub. So you can go to our GitHub project, you can see all of the docs that we have for the API. You can take, if something isn't clear, you can fork it, fix it, and submit a pull request, and we'll read over what you changed and figure out if we want to incorporate that or not. We do actually accept those pull requests on a regular basis. And then the really cool thing I think that we did was we actually now have continuous integration for our documentation. And you might be like, what does that mean? So we have a system that understands the format of our documentation because it's all in Markdown, and understands all of the examples that we have within the documentation, and actually pulls that content out of the docs, builds test cases around it, and then executes those test cases against our service to make sure that every example that we give you in the documentation works as it's written against the service, returns the set of properties and the set of metadata that you're expecting to get back, and that nothing in our documentation as far as examples is concerned doesn't work the way that it looks like it does. And the way that you can really see that that's what's going on is if you go to dev.onedrive.com and you click on our documentation and you scroll all the way to the bottom, you can see our app.var build status, and it says, hey, build is passing. And so if this is ever not green, then that means something is wrong inside our documentation. And if you click on it, you can actually come in and see what it is that we're doing. So you can see that we go grab the docs. We actually go through some consistency checks to make sure that there's no broken links in the documentation, that all of the JSON in the documentation is correct, that all of the ways that we've defined resources and the ways that our examples consume those resources is consistent. And then down at the bottom, we actually will start making these API calls against the service, one for every example in the service, figure out how it worked, make sure that all of the results are the right, and then how long it actually took to execute each of those requests. So we think that this tool really helps us ensure that the documentation is correct, that all of the examples that we're giving you are correct, and that everything in there is nice and clean and supported and way better than what we've had in the past. And so, as you guys are reading the docs or you guys are digging into the service and have questions, open issues in GitHub, that's a great place for us to track feedback on the docs, or send us pull requests for things that you think need to be updated. Or just let me know and I will go fix them too. So key takeaways, I'm going to give you guys about 10 minutes left for Q&A at the end. We think this is a great time to go start building great app experiences by connecting to where the content is. As more and more files get pulled into OneDrive and more users expect to be able to access their OneDrive content from all of the applications they're using, this is a great time to build OneDrive support into those applications. Just depending on having our sync client sync those files down to the local disk and then having the user access them out of their local hard drive isn't really enough. As we look at selective sync models and as more and more people put more content in OneDrive, all of those files won't necessarily be available on the device that they're looking for directly. And so calling straight into the API is going to be very important. It's also the same pattern that we're doing for Office and other Microsoft properties, as we're saying it isn't just enough to have Win32 file system access anymore. We now need to think about the cloud and connecting to cloud partners like OneDrive to get to that content. We've built an API that should make connecting to OneDrive easy and fast. We're continuing to work on that and building SDKs to make it even faster than just calling our API directly. And we really feel like we're on a journey to keep making this better and keep investing in this space. So as you guys dig in and have feedback about what's going on, come talk to us, come let us know what's happening. Talk to me while you're here, talk to us on email, talk to us via GitHub. Just connect to us as part of this community, and we can work together to make sure that we have a great set of APIs to make integrating OneDrive, OneDrive for Business, and SharePoint into your apps super easy. So call to action, go start building your great cloud apps on top of our OneDrive API today. Go figure out OneDrive for Business and how the API works on that side of things, and empower your applications to get content and put content into OneDrive. Our website, dev.onedrive.com, is sort of the hub for all of this activity. It's a great place to come learn what's going on in the APIs, read the documentation, play around with it. We have interactive samples in the API console, so you can get started directly playing with the API without actually writing any code or dealing with authentication. We collect and monitor feedback from all over the place. We look at Stack Overflow, we look at GitHub and our user voice page to know what's going on, to know what's broken, and to engage with the community. I really encourage all of you, if you have questions or problems or concerns, come to those places because we're there actively monitoring them. The engineers who work on this stuff are there actively monitoring them. We really want to be plugged in with you guys to make sure that we're not blocking what you're doing. And then user voice is a great place to sort of share feature suggestions and let other people vote on them and be able to help us prioritize what our backlog looks like and where we should be going next with the API. And a great way to join the community, if you haven't seen it already, is the Office 365 Developer Launch Program, or Developer Program Launch. It's this new thing that we've done to sort of create a better community around people developing for Office 365. There's now email newsletters. You can get a free year of Office 365 Developer, so you can actually start building apps without buying a developer subscription. There's training and tools and webinars. So if you go to dev.office.com/devprogram, you can sign up and get those benefits. And then the last point before I sort of open it up for questions is please evaluate the session. Let us know what we're doing well, what we need to go improve on. That feedback is really important to making sure that we're doing the right talks here at Ignite and in future conferences, and that we're delivering what it is that you're looking for. So take a picture with your phone, use the app to go rate the session, and let us know what we need to do better and what you liked about today's session. And with that, I am happy to take questions that you guys might have. I think there's microphones set up on either side if you want to ask a question. Or you can just ask.
Getting the link for sharing, is there a way to get the shortened link?
So the question is there a way to get the shortened API link for sharing links? There isn't today. It's on our list. Feel free to go vote for it on user voice to improve the priority of that. Yeah?
Maybe a tad bit off topic, but can we use this for SharePoint Online?
Yes, yeah. So the question was, can you use this for SharePoint Online? The OneDrive API from OneDrive for Business isn't just limited to OneDrive for Business. Once you have the team site URL or the URL that gets you to a document library, you can use the same API just by doing /API/v2.0/drive, and we'll treat the default document library like a drive anywhere within SharePoint Online. It is, the question is it for just the root default drive? It is for the default document library within any site, yeah. If you're interested in, right now we feel okay about having it scoped it that way. If you feel like there's important scenarios where accessing other document libraries is important, let me know. That's it? Okay. Well, I'll be around. I'll be actually at the OneDrive booth tomorrow morning if you have more questions that you think of, or if you go play with this stuff tonight and want to ask me about it. But thank you for all your time today and for coming to this talk, and go build apps on OneDrive for Business, please.